Angin kencang itu menuntut satu kemahuan, menegaskan satu pendirian, bahawa bahasa Melayu itu satu perjuangan kemerdekaan, lambang perpaduan kebangsaan. 22 Jun 1956, hasil daripada kesaktian lidah rakyat, kami lahir sebagai institusi keramat dengan nama Dewan Bahasa dan Pustaka. Angin semilir bertiup perlahan-lahan memupuk rasa cinta dan penghayatan. Kami percaya ubur perjuangan mendaulatkan bahasa kebangsaan perlu sentiasa disemarakkan nyalanya. Angin kencang itu kembali datang membawa suara bantahan, meluahkan rasa kekecewaan. Sesungguhnya, bahasa Melayu itu mesti dipertahankan. Angin timur dan barat membawa harumnya wangian bahasa Melayu ke seluruh tanah air tercinta, melahirkan ribuan cerdik pandai, merentasi pelbagai bidang ilmu, memperkaya khazanah kesusastraan, mendepani segala perubahan zaman. Kami hadir dengan semangat dan harapan memandaikan generasi masa hadapan yang tetap bertunjangkan kebangsaan. Angin sendalu menderu lembut, lalu membiaskan kedinginan. Dalam dunia yang sentiasa mengejar kepesatan, kami angin kencang itu menuntut satu kemahuan, menegaskan satu pendirian, bahawa bahasa Melayu itu satu perjuangan kemerdekaan, lambang perpaduan kebangsaan. 22 Jun 1956, hasil daripada kesaktian lidah rakyat, kami lahir sebagai institusi keramat dengan nama Dewan Bahasa dan Pustaka. Angin semilir bertiup perlahan-lahan memupuk rasa cinta dan penghayatan. Angin kencang itu menuntut satu kemahuan, menegaskan satu pendirian, bahawa bahasa Melayu itu satu perjuangan kemerdekaan, lambang perpaduan kebangsaan. 22 Jun 1956, hasil daripada kesaktian lidah rakyat, kami lahir sebagai institusi keramat dengan nama Dewan Bahasa dan Pustaka. Angin semilir bertiup perlahan-lahan memupuk rasa cinta dan penghayatan. Kami percaya ubur perjuangan mendaulatkan bahasa kebangsaan perlu sentiasa disemarakkan nyalanya. Angin kencang itu kembali datang.
Suruh chairperson tidak suruh dalam angkat suara.
That's okay, I'll do it. Can you guys say something so he can test if you can be heard on live stream? Just say something.
Hi.
Seorang, one by one.
Hi. Hello. Testing. 1, two,
Is that okay?
Wait, eh?
1, 2, 3. Testing, testing. 4.
Okay.
Okay. Shaki?
Yeah, hello. I'm.
Okay.
Hi, hello.
Hello.
Hello. Hello.
Judges, can you start now?
No, just let them do it.
The panel of distinguished educators, ladies and gentlemen. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and a very good day to all of you who are present today in this Royal Nation University Debating Championship 2022. First of all, allow me to introduce myself. My name is Atfal Fazmi, and I'll be the speaker for this round. Without further ado, let us begin our debate session now. I will start first by introducing all the debaters that will share out their arguments and suggestions for today's motion. Representing the government team, I would like to welcome Ms. Anis Sofia Ismail as the Prime Minister, Mr. Brian Sinchinhan as the Deputy Prime Minister, Mr. Muhammad Ikram Firdaus bin Sharif as the government whip, and the revised speech will be delivered by Mr. Brian Sinchinhan. Next, representing the opposition team, I would like to welcome Mr. Haikal Daniel bin Muhammad Hasbi as the leader of opposition, Mr. Wan Amirul Shakir bin Wan Ahmad Rafidi as the deputy leader of opposition, Mr. Adam bin Muhammad Hafiz as the opposition whip, and the revised speech will be delivered by Mr. Wan Amirul Shakir bin Wan Ahmad Rafidi. Ladies and gentlemen, I will now introduce the distinguished educators for this round. Please welcome the Chief Educator, Ms. Tasia Khairunisa. The second educator, Mr. Christopher Lau. And the third educator, Mr. Mubashir Ayub. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm pretty sure that all of you have understood the ground rules for every debate session. However, please allow me to humbly remind all of us of the rules and regulations that need to be added to as follows. First, during the debate, please silence your mobile phone or any device that will produce disturbing sounds. Second, for substantive speech sessions, the bell will ring once at the first and the 6th minute. At the 7th minute, the bell will ring twice. Third, for the reply speech session, the bell will ring once at the 3rd minute and twice at the 4th minute. Ladies and gentlemen, please be informed that the motion for today's debate is this House believes that the IMF should provide an unconditional economic bailout to Sri Lanka. To open the debate, I would like to call upon the Prime Minister from the government team, Ms. Anis Sofia Ismail, to propose a motion. Please welcome.
Sri Lanka was in this mess to begin with because of the unrealistic promises that they made to stay in power in the very start. We think that China's bailout constraints will only further create worse policies and will not fix any of the mess that has existed in state school. Two things that I'll prove in my speech today. Number one, why is it necessary for a bailout to happen? And number two, why exactly are the conditions attached to a bailout never going to be met? And even if it is met, it is going to be extremely harmful for the people of Sri Lanka. But before that, three important pieces of contextualization. Number one, let's understand what's actually happening in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is facing an extreme case of socio-economic instability. The things that are happening right now looks like, number one, high levels of unemployment. Number two, inaccessible staple food because of the high prices. Number three, they also have extremely high imports and very low amounts of exports, which eventually leads to the zero amount of foreign currency left in their reserves. What is important to note is that this all means that as a result of this instability, there has been an extreme number of protests happening within Sri Lanka, and there is already an extreme social unrest that is currently happening. Secondly, what exactly does a bailout look like, and what would the conditions essentially look like? A bailout is a capital injection to help rescue these countries from the current state of economy that they are currently in. What are the conditions that are already being in the discussion about what you're going to give to Sri Lanka? This looks like, number one, ensuring that there is government stability before receiving these bailouts. Number two, the ability to generate revenue from these loans. Number three, the willingness to restructure debts. And number four, increasing tax revenues per se. All of these are extremely difficult conditions to be met, especially given the scarcity of the situation that we talked about earlier. Therefore, meaning that this means that if these conditions were to be set in place, this government would take unreasonable measures to ensure that these conditions can be met at a very short time span. But thirdly, what are the alternatives to an economic bailout provided by the IMF that the Sri Lanka government might be resorting to in the absence of these bailouts? We think that they would actually go after their debtors, i.e. China, Japan, and India. And this is particularly because of the fact that these debtors have already showed their willingness to restructure certain loans, but these debtors also come with strings attached to their own bailouts. What exactly do these strings look like? It looks like being able to give you a certain sum if you agree to lend or to lease a certain part of your port or your land to these particular countries, and therefore this means that these incentives are predatory and is not the best for Sri Lanka moving forward. What exactly is the first argument in today's debate? Number one, why exactly is the bailout by IMF necessary? We told you earlier in our first contextualization that the Sri Lanka situation is extremely bad right now. What exactly is the extent of the direness of the situation? We think that people have actually been harmed and even led to death with a lot of these people because of the situation that they are put under. Number one, this means that they have been protesting in a lot of extreme cases involving violence. But number two, this also means because of the fact that they can no longer access people's food, this means that they also lack the important food supply and therefore often suffer from starvation. No, thank you. But thirdly, this also means that they are in a state of hopelessness because they are not sure as to what exactly and how long do they need to wait for under the same old policies in order for them to actually be able to get any form of help from any other parties. What exactly does IMF has to do with the situation, and why do we have an obligation to care? Within the very fact that the IMF has been promoting economic stability in all countries, that important thing to look out because the instability of one country in particular will therefore lead to the inability to generate revenue for the international economy. This also therefore means that they cannot by any means allow these countries to be suffering under the bailouts provided by other debtors, primarily predatory debtors, because of the fact that it will cause even further harm towards Sri Lanka's economy in particular. But then, what exactly is the alternative? Because IMF extremely predatory and will not benefit Sri Lanka or the global economy at all. This is because of the fact that we've already said that it's likely going to be looking at Japan, China, and India. What exactly is going to happen if they take certain loans or bailouts from these countries? Number one, we've already seen this happening before. China has a history of putting people under debt trap diplomacy. This particularly means that you are going to give you a large sum at first hand, but you are going to be leasing ports and lands to them in exchange for as part of their One Belt One Road initiative to begin with. What essentially means that is that Sri Lanka is just going to be another Pakistan that will suffer under the weight of this debt trap diplomacy. But secondly, we also think that every country in and of itself already have personal incentives when they want to enter into trades, etc. This means that they are aware that there are certain benefits that they can get even at the harm and at the expense of another country, and they don't have any general incentive like the IMF has to actually rescue one country. Everything that they do is for their own self-interest. And therefore, we think it's essential that these sort of bailouts come from IMF and not others. Second argument. What exactly is it that the conditions are never going to be met, and even if it's met, it's going to be harmful? But before that, yes.
There are no incentives to the new incumbent government Ranil to create and structure loans that is different from the Raja's one.
Right, so the response to that is that there is actually an incentive for that to happen. Why is that so? There are two reasons why. Number one is because of the fact that they've already seen what happens to the first Raya Paksa minister to begin with. He has already been fleeing the country because of the very fact that people are unhappy with the way that he is governing and that there are already extreme protests that he already has to cater to. But number two, if he is unable to cater to these protests and actually make a difference, what happens is that he's going to be the next Raya Paksa Prime Minister, right? And he has an incentive to not do so because he wants to stay in power and to actually convince people that his governance is better than the previous governance. Therefore, there is a better incentive for these money to actually be used appropriately and not towards even worse policies that could happen at the end of the day. But moving on to my second argument, which is why conditions are never going to be met, and even if it's met, it's going to be harmful. We think that the requirement, particularly of political stability, is one that is not going to take a short term to actually be resolved. This is particularly true because even after electing the new Prime Minister, we've seen how difficult it is for the current Prime Minister to gain support from other political parties, given the fact that there is still a lot of social unrest affecting the decisions of these political parties. What this particularly means is that if you want to actually meet the conditions that are set by the IMF, i.e. getting political stability, what's likely going to happen is that they are going to clamp down on any social protests or movements that are currently happening within Sri Lanka. This means that these people will no longer get any avenue or platform to actually voice out their unhappiness with the government or to criticize the government, because clamping down these protests and having less violence therefore means political stability. This only encourages a far worse world whereby political showmanship becomes the forefront of their government and not actually ensuring that these conditions are being met at its truest form. Therefore, at the end of the day, what happens under their world is that there is going to be a lot of disguises on the at the extent of that proving that they will actually fulfill this rules. What happens under our world? At the end of the day, under our world, with this bailout particularly, we are able to actually get better economic policies that can only exist when we have the money to do so, and therefore help the farmers and the workers who are retrenched and suffering as a result of these harmful policies in the past. All those reasons for
Thank you, Ms. Prime Minister. Up next, I would like to invite the Leader of Opposition, Mr. Haikal Daniel bin Muhammad Hasni, to present your arguments. Please welcome.
It's not really a humanitarian organization, and just what, like I'm explaining to you, what is the IMF? The main purpose is to ensure the stability of the economy of the country. It is important for you to note that they haven't actually proved why exactly Sri Lanka will actually create a stable economy in the future. They just say, well, IMF has an obligation to protect the life of the people. Not only that, not actual principle that IMF hold, it also proves to us that they don't actually care about like restructuring the economy stability that plunged Sri Lanka into all this economic recession and economic problem, which is why they're going to lose today. Let's be clear what exactly we support on the opposition side and why exactly a lot of our state can actually pick up their problems. Firstly, I just want to you that we actually prefer the condition that exists within like the bailout itself. So for example, we prefer like the restructuring of the debt, which means that instead we're trying to actually help them to pay off the debt to China and also Japan and India. Secondly, it probably looks like increasing the tax revenue because the fact that they decided to actually reduce the tax and give a lot of tax, which is the cost of like all of their economy come in the first place. Or thirdly, proving like the stability of like, the economy of the country and the politics itself. I just want to note to you, this suggests that well, the political stability looks like trying to climb down on the people. I don't think that's the case, right? A lot lot of people, when it comes to like the proving stability of like the politics, it probably looks like trying to change into a democracy, trying to actually have a accountability mechanism that exists within the country, that to make sure that you have all the democratic norms that exist within the country to ensure that Sri Lanka has the accountability that exists to ensure they will not actually create this incident. The thing that I want to note the most, and which missing from the Prime Minister coming before me, is that the fact that we'll be doing it in terms of like the prong itself. That is to say, there will be a progress that will happen, and it's probably going to take like 20 years, just like how like IMF done with Indonesia, for example. We're probably going to actually give them money to bail out based on like what is their progress. So for example, they will try to restructure all of their debt and all their economic problems and try to actually prove their political stability, and will give them their money based on like the progress that they have. That means that it doesn't have to be like happen immediately, which is the problem coming from the Prime Minister. It can actually happen in a progress, which is why we think that on ourselves we are able to actually solve this problem. And I just want to know in terms of like the burden here, right? Because I just want to know on their side, they suggest that well, Sri Lanka will actually like at the end will do all of these conditions. So for example, like restructuring their economic system and try to actually change a lot of things, right? If that's the case, then there's no debate, because this debate has to happen in the situation where Sri Lanka doesn't actually want to follow the condition that exists in the first place, and that's what they have to defend on their side. We just have to tell you why is that Sri Lanka will follow at the point where they have all these conditions in the first place, right? So three arguments coming from our side. First, the principle of IMF. Second, why exactly unconditional aid actually will harm the future stability of Sri Lanka, and finally the globalization of Sri Lanka in the first place. But for that, I just have two pieces of rebuttal towards like the speaker before me. The first thing I want to know is that this is just to us like, well, they will go to China or India at the point where you actually create this condition in the first place. I just want to you that a lot of the problem about why exactly this condition cannot be met or be solved by ourselves in terms of like the progress that they will do. But secondly, here's why the incentive why they will actually change. Number one, it's the fact that they already rely on the China for too long. That means that they will actually need to find a way to actually remove themselves from like the China debt trap itself. So for example, at the point where China actually put them into the China debt trap, it caused them a lot of harm, and they feel like they need to actually get out of it. But they couldn't do that simply because they don't have the money to actually pay it back. At the point where you have IMF to actually like give the idea that you shouldn't rely on China and you should rely on Earth, they are able to actually restructure their debt and get out of it, right? But second, it's the fact that they want to actually rebuild their economy because they are going into recession. They are having all the problems that the Prime Minister already talked about, which is more reasons for them to actually follow this condition, because they realize that the problem itself is very hard. But thirdly, note that as well that China and also India also have like their own condition, just what like the Prime Minister suggested, which means that the condition that exists on IMF is far less like harmful compared to like the China and India option in the first place, which is why they will change. The second thing I'm going to know in terms of like the IMF has an obligation. I will deal a lot more in my argument, but I just want to know to you the problem that they suggest is that IMF need to actually protect the life of the people. At the point where they don't actually solve the economic crisis that exists and also doesn't structure back all these economic problems, that means that in the future they will cause a lot more harm, which means that on their side they will cause a lot more harm to the life of the people in the future, which is very, very harmful. Before I move on to two of my arguments, I'll take you on.
So the mechanism is based on progression of bailouts, right? But to run Sri Lanka, they still need to take loans. Why then won't they take loans from countries like China, India, and Japan, which has already given them loans up to this point?
Because that's what the condition says, that they don't want to take from China. Principle then. Why exactly IMF? I have the principle. I just want to tell you what exactly the purpose of IMF in the first place. I think it's to actually create a condition where they are able to ensure that all the countries that they are giving the loans and also the bailout are able to actually create a stable economy in the first place. Why exactly this exists? Because there is a crisis systemic problem that exists in Sri Lanka that actually caused all of this problem and then plunged them into the economic crisis in the first place. And I think that IMF exists as a way to actually ensure that they're able to actually fix all of these problems in the first place. Why is the moral harm at the point where you don't have any condition where you will create no conditional aid in the first place, right? Number one, it's the fact that you create a precedent for the IMF to actually reward for a country who actually doesn't actually try to save them, tries to actually ensure that their economy is actually stable in the first place. So for example, in the future, people can actually, like any country can actually point to Sri Lanka as a president saying that, well, we don't need to actually fix our economic problem. We can just take, we can use IMF as a means to ensure that we are able to actually stay alive. This is a very huge problem because a lot of problems that exist with Sri Lanka can actually be solved if they want to actually solve it, right? On our side of the house, we are able to actually solve it because we push the Sri Lanka to actually take this solution in the first place. On their side of the house, they no longer come the narrative to solve this problem, which means that on their side of the house, they're not able to actually create any systematic problem on their side, systematic solution on their side of the house. This argument will prove why exactly IMF exists as a standard to ensure that the country are able to ensure that countries actually follow the economic stability. And regardless of what exactly this the outcome of this debate. This principle is important because this debate is about IMF. Second argument, why exactly unconditional aid will harm Sri Lanka? I just want to tell you is that this debate will be about like both sides will try to actually solve the economic problem of Sri Lanka. But the key thing to note on the unique thing about opposition side is that we're able to actually create a better like economic stability and economic system for the future. Why exactly they cannot change that on their side of the house? First, it's the fact that politicians run on the populist policy to actually like win vote and win election. The fact that a lot of politicians use things such as like raise tax rate or like reduce the tax to ensure that they're able to win because of like the people love the tax rate in the first place. But secondly, it's the fact that they have like China, like all the elitists and all the government love to actually be with China. But the problem is that Sri Lanka doesn't want China anymore, which is why we see the outcry in the first place. Why is this important? Because I mean on their side, they haven't put to us why exactly they are able to solve this problem, which means in the future, this problem will continue to occur again in the future. How do we solve it on our side of the house? The fact is, IMF are able to control the monetary policy within the country itself, which means that they're able to ensure that they don't do things such as like give a tax break and also like give like the lower tax in the first place. But secondly, it creates a better way to actually escape from the China debt trap because we are able to actually give them a better alternative. Far worse. The way here is that on our side of the house, both sides will solve the problem. On our side of the house, we're able to create better changes into the economic system for these reasons. Proud to oppose.
Thank you. Now, I would like to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister from the government team, Mr. Brian Singh Shihan, to continue for the motion. Please welcome.
Side opposition is already in a losing position this debate. The reason for this is twofold. Firstly, they're extremely uncontentious and their case is extremely confusing, but secondly, they have been unresponsive to a lot of the arguments and material that others have raised. What does this look like? Firstly, the leader of opposition agrees with our context and framing that Sri Lanka is a problematic position both politically and economically, but they want to bring out the comparative resolution as being like based on progress, and they're able to therefore award that like IMF conditional loan based on progress. But they prove no link and no structural reason or analysis as to how they're able to get that particular progress in the first place. Because without any money, without capital injection, without revenue, you're not going to get the political and economic reforms that they want. You're not being able to get the domestic policies that solves unemployment, that does things such as combat maybe foreign interference, which all exist under their side of the house. Because no money literally equals to no reforms. That's why the alternative that we gave to you in terms of the harmful alternatives, which is Japan, China, India, is far worse because you're forced to rely on these countries, and these countries, unlike the IMF, are perverse in incentives and don't have any accountability structures. Like legit Southeast Asia and OBOR have been dominating around the world. You literally see many Chinese investment projects and many debt-trap diplomacy projects, like the Wada port in Pakistan, which was literally leased and is going to be permanently converted into a Chinese asset because they can't pay back the loan in time. So eventually, they're going to morph Sri Lanka into a Chinese puppet state. They're going to morph Sri Lanka into a state which secedes or which is beholden towards China and its investments. And that's extremely problematic. I'll take you later. So that's why they don't show the causal link, and I think that's why their case dissolves and dies during this debate. So two arguments stand. What is the way in which this debate should be weighed on, and the two metrics in which this debate should be weighed on. Firstly, whether an unconditional IMF bailout is the only way to solve Sri Lanka's problems, and secondly, in terms of extension, why we're able to prevent Sri Lanka from being a puppet state. So firstly, whether an unconditional IMF bailout is the only way to solve Sri Lanka's problems. And I think Anis did a good job in telling you the status quo of the problems existing in Sri Lanka right now. This looks like a shortage of food, fuel, and medicine. The economy is in a really precarious position. The currency has crashed. There's literally zero foreign currency reserve. There's $7 billion in debt, and they import more than they export. What does this all mean? This means to say that because they don't have the government revenue in order to create policies, they're again forced to rely on external actors. And being forced to rely on external actors means to say that like you're forced to cede to their demands, you're forced to cede both their political demands and also economic incentive structures which are precarious and which are perverse in nature, and that's extremely problematic. So all of this paints a sense of extreme urgency within the country, and this extreme urgency means that the Sri Lankan government is desperate, the Sri Lankan people are desperate, and therefore the desperation pushes them into making like very problematic decisions. That's why a lot of like maybe South Asian countries or some like African countries always like have to sell their country's soul towards like under economic hegemony countries like China and US, because like these countries are able to promise them short-term loans and loans which are able to help the economy grow, but they're forced to seek some pieces of land and informally. So second like part in this first argument is the political policies of previous administrations and why they're extremely problematic. I'll take it a bit. So in terms of political policies of previous administrations and why will it therefore carry through to the current Ranil Wickremesinghe government, well, for that I'll take it.
If your bailout is unconditional, will it be fine if Sri Lanka trades with China?
So
if your bailout is unconditional, will it be fine if Sri Lanka goes on and trades with China?
That's why we solve the problem. Because it is unconditional, they don't need to rely on China. They don't need to rely on Chinese investments. They have their own money to spend. They don't need to take a loan from China. So those are the political policies of previous administrations. So understand that the Gotabaya and Rajapaksa dynasty made a lot of unpopular policies, like forcing farmers to go completely organic, policies which revolve around external actors, and doing things such as making huge tax cuts to a lot of MNCs and international companies investing in having foreign direct investment in China. Why was this the case, and why did he make a lot of unpopular policies? It's because he wanted to consolidate his power. He was lobbied by Chinese CCP actors and international state actors coming from Japan and India as well. And this is extremely problematic because he wanted to stay in power, he wanted to have quid pro quo benefit agreements with these countries, and he's forced to secede to their demands and therefore make unpopular policies which led him to stay in power. This would then eventually mean that the current incumbent administration of Ranil Wickremesinghe will obviously have to continue these policies because he's also in a desperate position. On one hand, he wants to improve the economy. On the other hand, he also needs to continue these policies because he wants to consolidate his power. So he sees these short-term loans, or he sees these maybe long-term loans as an easy way out of the economic problems that they're having right now, and therefore he has to secede to the demands and therefore take into account what his previous prime minister and previous leader did, and therefore continue this legacy. And this legacy is extremely problematic because again you promoted towards all these policies. So secondly, in terms of how these policies then morph. So these policies also look like them being forced to spend billions of dollars on projects which become duds or which become quite useless. So China develops a lot of infrastructure and develops a lot of projects. So this looks like the Lotus Tower in Sri Lanka, which costs almost $1 billion, but is now not being used at all. It's now an abandoned project because they don't see much of the use of the Lotus Tower, or certain cricket stadiums which don't actually morph into projects which guarantee ROI or return on investments. This is extremely problematic because if they don't have any ROI or they become duds on useless projects or projects which are abandoned for completion, they're essentially quite useless and they don't guarantee any form of return of investment towards the country or any form of tax generation towards the country as well. Lastly, in terms of the current government showing efforts of stability. So currently, the government of Ranil Wickremesinghe has begun to make some good policies such as job creation and resuming tax on companies and lifting the forced organic imposition of farming. This all shows a trend analysis on why the current incoming government is already making efforts with good policies, but it's unsustainable. The reason it's unsustainable is because he doesn't have enough money to make all these good policies work. So they only last in the short term, but if you have IMF loans, it lasts in the long term. So lastly, in terms of comparative between IMF and countries like China, India, and Japan, IMF is an international organization headed by many countries, funded by many countries, so it's independent and not biased and don't have perverse incentives. They send officers, experts, and economists to give advice to developing countries. Compare this to China, India, and Japan. They have things such as OWAR, BRI. They have depth of diplomacy. They have incentive to give a loan, and if you can't pay back within a number of years, they lease that port or they take that piece of land forever, such as the Guara port in Pakistan. In the very worst case scenario, accountability structures can still happen if he was to still fuck up, even though he gets the unconditional IMF loan. This looks like the Sri Lankan Freedom Party, the United National Party, and the various protests and demonstrations which overthrew the Rajapaksa government and are able to do the same towards the Ranil Wickremesinghe government if he were to continue on this. The political incentive, therefore, is very strong to make Sri Lanka better.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Prime Minister. Up next, I would like to invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition, Mr. Wan Amir Shakir and Wan Ahmad Rafini, to present your arguments. Please welcome.
I really don't understand why on the comparative on Gulf, Sri Lanka wouldn't go to China. Because it's literally unconditional, which means that the money will be given to the Iranian government and the Iranian government will allocate its funds. They will not be given, the IMF has no power over the central authority or the central bank or their monetary policy. They have no power over the policy and mechanisms that are in place within the Sri Lankan government after the IMF bailout. This means that if government wants to argue that the comparative is China, government allows that China as an alternative because IMF has no power over the economic and political policies that the Iranian government will probably employ at the end of the day. Which means that their counterfactual has never really proven why they will not take money from China. All the harms that the previous speaker talked to me about how China is a bad actor will probably exist on that side of the house as well. Right? I'll give you an argument as to how the IMF will be used as a political weapon to the Iranian government in future elections, and this is the comparative best engaged to the best case on that side of the house. Firstly, let's clarify what unconditional really means, right? Because I really don't think government did that. We think that unconditional means that there will be no control over the political policies and economic policies. There will be no infrastructure that is dictated by the IMF. We argued to you in the setup that the comparative is far better because the IMF is there to decide on what exactly the money will be used for. Things like infrastructure, things like education systems, all these things were absent in the Rajapaksa government that relied on populism in order to stay in power. The comparative, if government wants to argue that the Iranian government is comparatively similar to Rajapaksa, those things exist on that side of the house. They haven't proven any incentive. Let's weigh up what the likelihood of success of the IMF bailout really looks like. Sure, it's true that we have to prove that the Sri Lankan government has to prove that they can pay back their loans. But this is far easier when you have the IMF overseeing you through conditional loans and bailouts. The reason why is because number one, we have expertise over and control over the monetary policy, which means that the IMF is a technocrat, is an institution that will always rely on what is economically sound. This is different from what is systemic within Sri Lanka over the years. The historically most popular way in which politicians stay in power is through populism. And unfortunately, a lot of these populist ideologies are antithetical to economic progress. Things like giving handouts to the poorest of the poor in order to generate some votes will inevitably mean that nepotism continues to be entrenched within the government. Things like tax cuts mean inflation increases for the vast majority of people, but leads you and makes the Rajapaksa government stay in power. Given that this is the context that even government concedes, populism is ripe within these countries, the comparative that government will uphold then is the proliferation of these policies because there is no condition to change or stifle these types of harmful political practices. We have it better because even though there are really unpopular politically, will not get any political currency, this is better because we get more economically sound policies. But I think it's also better comparatively because so that's one as to why there is a huge difference systemically to how the IMF operates. But secondly, right, I think it's comparatively better because now we have an institution that is guarded by the US and the US, which has the best accountability mechanisms on earth. This is way better because now you have an institution that will not that is far different from the China and comparatively different from the that type of diplomacy that China has been doing. Now, if government concedes that we are in a critical juncture where there is mass protest against China, the other alternative on the table is then the IMF. If the alternative is the IMF, this is better, and if there is a lot of political will to support the IMF, this is better because now you have an institution that has accountability mechanisms that will at the very least allow these countries more time and room to pay in the long run, given its anticipate exist in the long run as well. Those are two mechanisms as to how there is a higher likelihood of success on our side of the house once they accept conditional aid, and Sri Lanka will not fall into the same oppression that often the government is conceding will exist. Before I move on to this argument, I'll give you a
Okay, so under your world, IMF conditional loans are based on either reforming the system as a whole or making significant progress. To do either one of that, you need initial capital. So the comparative ability depends.
So are you against initial progress? Then are you against like changing the system that you yourself conceive is systemic, right? Because you cannot push us the burden on China when you have no guarantee that Sri Lanka will not go to China at the end of the day, given that it's unconditional as well. Argument on how the IMF is used as a political weapon with the Renal government in future elections. When it's unconditional, the IMF has no power of the economic policy, which means the power is controlled by the incumbent. This is harmful for a number of reasons. The first is that it legitimizes Renal's political leadership. If it's true that it's number one unconditional and the West is seen as a strong ally as government conceives that the public likes, this will whitewash or clean up the reputation of the Renal government. If they themselves concede that they will rely on populism and political ideologies, and how we have characterization as to how Renal is really like close friends with the Rajapaksa family anyway, which is exactly why the people in Sri Lanka is still protesting them even after the elections. This means that Renal will now have the legitimacy of the IMF backing up his political campaign. This is problematic because all of the problems that government says exist happens continuously. The cycle of economic oppression proliferate. You have tokenized the Sri Lankan government. But secondly, the IMF can't hold that government accountable, economically accountable anymore because there is no longer a mechanism in order to change the government. If it's true that the IMF cannot sway elections and cannot make the Renal government topple down. But at the very least, we have institutions that like employ infrastructure, which inevitably in the future makes increases globalization. So people on the ground can understand much better as to what the Renal government is really doing. This is better because we have an IMF that's doing it, that is historically a Western institution that holds globalization as opposed to China, which is largely comparative on that side of the house. The way here is simple. We are opposing the cycle of economic oppression. If the best case on Gov is that they get the money and they can use the money, that money is very short term because all these same problems that we highlight that they themselves concede exist continuously. The handouts will be the main roadmap as to how they get political success. Cutting down tax will be the roadmap to political success on that side of the house. So maybe opposition can survive tomorrow, but in the long run, these people will comparatively be more harmed. This is exactly why populism is the only way that government can get out of the political crisis for so long as they have never really proven an incentive as to how this is an economically sound policy and how this is and how the Rajapaksa or the Renal government is far different economically or politically, then that's the exact reason why they have successfully lost the debate. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Leader of Opposition. Moving on, I would like to call upon the government leader, Mr. Muhammad Ukram Firdaus bin Sharif, to continue proposing a motion on behalf of the government team. Please welcome.
Starting the speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, notice that all of their arguments are contingent on number one, their framing being true, and number two, that they get these loans to begin with. Insofar as we prove that their mechanism doesn't work, we take this. Firstly, why is it the mechanism of this progressional bailout doesn't work? Number one, in order for you to get this bailout to begin with, you need to provide the IMF with some kind of progress, i.e. you need to show them that you've done something, right? This means that you need some kind of reform. Reform always means some kind of money. When you have things like tax cuts, the government has to subsidize that tax cuts. This means that the government needs the money to begin with, i.e. to run the country, therefore this kind of progress isn't going to happen whatsoever, therefore the IMF loan isn't going to materialize. But even if they find some kind of money, straight by and get some kind of progress to begin with, this means that the bailout isn't going to be a holistic, i.e. it's not going to be one-off. This means that there's still going to be some kind of gap that Sri Lanka has to cover, and this gap is going to be covered by more loans. Therefore, this creates a spiraling effect, right? Whereby because of this gap existing, you need to take in more loans and more loans, so the bailout keeps on progressing. I think that is why their mechanism doesn't necessarily work. Two issues in this debate. Number one, whether the unconditional bailout is bad, and number two, whether or not Sri Lanka is going to take loans from countries like China and stuff like that, right? I think you have five. First issue, whether the unconditional bailout is bad. Two arguments for that. Number one, you reward the mismanagement of countries, and number two, you strengthen Renil's chokehold onto Sri Lanka. First argument, why is it untrue that you reward the mismanagement of countries, right? Number one, no country is going to be incentivized to bankrupt themselves just because Sri Lanka gives an unconditional loan, just because IMF gives an unconditional loan towards Sri Lanka, right? This is because oftentimes countries have more political gain to actually manage their economies well. Therefore, just because IMF gives this unconditional loan to Sri Lanka doesn't mean that other countries are just going to suddenly bankrupt themselves. But secondly, understand that accountability measures are much more prominent when you have an unconditional loan. This means that the people are going to ensure that Renil makes sure that this bailout is handled properly because they know that it is an unconditional loan. But even if all of this is untrue, understand that they ignore the comparative, right? The comparative is that we've mentioned exactly why Renil has the incentive to properly manage the bailout. This is because number one, he wants the political gain. This means that if he properly manages the bailout, he can get some kind of political advantage. But secondly, if he properly manages the bailout, he gets the economic advantage for Sri Lanka. Both of this serves his purpose. But why is it worse on their side, right? The reason as to why it's worse on their side is that when you want to get the bailout, you have things like political showmanship, number one, i.e. you need to show IMF that you have a stable government. Therefore, in order to get a stable government, they're going to do things like you build buildings which makes no sense whatsoever, just so that Renil has some kind of political clout. Therefore, he gets political stability. But number two, we have things like tax cuts, which oftentimes only serve the rich, i.e. the hyper-rich within Sri Lanka only benefit from tax cuts. If tax cuts really does not matter much to those who cannot even afford to buy fuel. This is why Anis's arguments are so important. Even if you get the conditions, the attempt of meeting those conditions are going to be so unbelievably bad for Sri Lanka that it hits the downward spiral and further strengthens the chokehold of Renil and the Rajapaksas onto Sri Lanka. But the second argument that they gave, right, that falls under this clash is that they're going to strengthen Renil's government, right? Why is it untrue? Number one, there's already enough inertia within the movement against Renil and the Rajapaksas for people to be suspicious of him. I think when you get this bailout, people are not immediately going to look at Renil as some kind of god that saved Sri Lanka. Instead, they're still going to be suspicious and know that it was Renil and the Rajapaksas who brought Sri Lanka into this condition to begin with. But secondly, when you have an unconditional bailout, you make the Renil more accountable. I think the people are going to be much more suspicious of him because it is unconditional. But why is it worse on the other side, right? Number one, you have things like clamping down that happens, i.e. in order to promote political stability, what's going to happen is that Renil is going to start a dictatorship, i.e. clamping down on the protests. But number two, you're going to have, even if Renil doesn't go this extreme, you're going to have things like populist rhetorics and populist policies. But that's outweighed. Let's say Renil does become a dictator, and let's say like their best side of the house like materializes. I think ours is still much more justified because in the attempt of like starting to get progress, you do still revert towards dictatorial tendencies. Sure.
Assuming in the future, Sri Lanka plunged into a crisis again because of they didn't change their economic system, are you willing to give this unconditional aid again?
That's not our willing to prove. Our willing to prove is to show that after they get this bailout, they are going to change their system because it is unconditional. Notice that because of the situation that they are in, Renil and the Rajapaksas have been ousted and they have gotten a lot of political backlash. This means that the second they get some kind of bailout and it's unconditional, they are going to have the necessary change. What's the link here, right? Why is it that they can't get the change on their side? The reason why they can't get the change on their side is because we've told you, any kind of reforms needs some money. Renil at this point in time has the incentive to reform himself and to reform Sri Lanka. But the reason why they can't do it on that side of the house is because Renil doesn't have the money to reform himself to begin with. This means that under our side of the house, Renil gets the money first, later on reforms himself and prevents Sri Lanka from falling into this situation to begin with. Second issue, whether Sri Lanka is going to take more money from China, right? They mentioned here that, this term is symmetrical. But even if it is symmetrical, let's just take them the best case scenario. The difference here is the magnitude as to how dependent you are on China. Under our world, if you get a full bailout, this means that you cover that cost, and the amount of loan that you have to take from China, India, and Japan is minimal in comparison with the loan that you have to take under your household, under your side of the house. Under your side of the house, you still need to take the loans to run your country while waiting for the other progressional, other tranches of the bailout. This means that you become much more dependent onto China, much more dependent onto India and Japan. This leads to more predatory debt pricing. So I think that the primary difference here is that the magnitude is much more different. This is why Sim's argument is so important, right? Notice that under your side of the house, the comparative is that you have to rely on these countries because while waiting for the bailout to materialize itself, you have no choice but to go to the country that has given you loans all this while. It's perfectly fine if Sri Lanka wants to take loans from China under our world because the amount of money that they take is much less and so much less as compared to their side of the house. For all these reasons, probably.
Thank you, Mr. Governor Wee. Moving on, I want to invite your machinery, Mr. Uitm bin Muhammad Hafiz, to present your argument. Please welcome.
Subjugation with Sri Lankans and the economic constraints that happen due to Rajapaksa is one that is visible. What government is proposing is that they want to rely on the Ramil's government in all good faith that they have with no pressure and no incentive to actually follow by the conditions of upholding democracy is going to backslide terribly. It's precisely because they think that Ramil is going to be the new leader of Sri Lanka without actually providing reasons as to why he will be one of a good government, despite the fact that he's still hiring old close ties of Rajapaksa within the government, is precisely the reason why they're going to turn to China and precisely the reason why they're going to screw over Sri Lankans even more. I'm going to give you two issues in this debate panel. First and foremost, why should the IMF make it conditional? And secondly, what is the likelihood of success? But a few clarifications need to be made in this debate today because I think government is confused as to how our mechanism looks like. Obviously, it's illogical to have initial progress if you don't give any money. So obviously, we'll give some form of money towards Sri Lankan's government to actually create some process. It's going to be some form of carrot rewarding method where we give you some money, we take a look at the KPI and see if you are actually upholding it. And if you are doing good with upholding democracy and just reviving your economy, then we're going to give you more money. That's the progress in which our first speaker gave it to you in the first speech today, which is precisely why it's going to be one of the good mechanisms to ensure that they are going to abide by the rules and they're going to make sure that the conditions are going to be met in order for them to revive the economy even further. Let's take a look at the first issue on why should the IMF make it conditional. What the government contend on this issue, and it's this really minuscule problem statement, they say that it's precisely because there are conditions made by the IMF, they are now forced to clamp down on protests to ensure that there are political stability. Two reasons why I think this is not likely. First and foremost, they consider that Ramil is the new leader for Sri Lanka, but if he wants to keep his image, then why the heck would he actually want to clamp down on protesters even more? This is creating another Rajapaksa situation here to make sure that he would be the next Rajapaksa and actually kicked out of office. This means that if he were to actually do some political clampdowns, two things are likely to happen. First and foremost, you will lose a lot of political currency, but secondly, you're going to actually spark more protests at the end of the day. So we say this is not the likelihood of the situation that's going to happen if we actually give the conditions. But secondly, the solution to this is to actually practice democracy as it is going to be a part of the condition. Firstly, protests are the byproduct of the failures of the state. This means that conditional bailouts will make Ramil actually listen to people to ensure that political stability is one that is going to happen. So the comparative here is that in the worst case scenario, if Ramil turns out to be bad, then we say our conditions are the ones who are going to force Ramil to actually be good in order for the betterment of Sri Lankans. But on the side of government, if Ramil turns out to be another Rajapaksa, they have no incentive to make sure Ramil is actually good when the money is already given to them at the end of the day. Before I move on to our comparative show.
So let's take your word, right? Let's say that people already do hate Ramil. So that means the political stability is voting Ramil out. Why then does Ramil have the incentive to listen to the people who's going to vote him out in order to achieve political stability?
I'm going to give you like one second issue on the likelihood of success, and I'm going to explain to you why Ramil is more likely going to take popular sentiments even more in order for them to actually remain power at their house. But moving on to my first issue, right? What do we contend on why should IMF make it conditional?
We say principally IMF is justified to make conditions on two impacts. First and foremost, we want to actually make sure that the IMF does not create bad precedents. It's because right now what they're doing is that the next time a country actually approaches IMF or vice versa to actually get bailouts, then they're going to use Sri Lanka as an example to actually make sure that they don't abide by the conditions in order for you to actually practice your global economic welfare. But secondly, it's going to be counterproductive under their side of the house, because when you have feedback of pressure from the IMF to make sure that your global welfare is going to be one is upheld, then you have no incentive to actually meaningful progressive changes, right? The reason why this is so important for IMF is because the stakeholder here is just more than Sri Lanka, right? The debate sides in a way as the position of what IMF should take in regards to Sri Lanka. We say that the byproduct of not making conditions for the IMF will in turn make the image of IMF deteriorate even more. So how do I weigh into this issue? Two reasons why. First and foremost, government drop on the principle of IMF and just assume that the IMF is just going to be a holier-than-thou body to just give money freely, and like they expect like the global economic welfare to be one that is progressive. But secondly, we give you enough reasons as to why the IMF is in a justifiable position to actually create conditions to change the system. So we move on to the second issue on the likelihood of success. What the government contend under this issue? They say the high urgency for money to recover from the crisis is one that is like utmost important, right? It's because they don't have the money they need right now to ensure that they can get progressive changes. Three problems I have with this. First and foremost, who is to facilitate how the money is going to be used? Rahman is stayed in close ties with the Rajapaksa family. Your best case scenario is going to be tokenism because of how you want Ramil to actually, just make the public pressure just like be mitigated down even more. This means that the likelihood for Ramil to actually be more of a bad leader on the background, but on the surface try to look like more of a progressive leader, is going to be high, precisely because you don't have the justification for accountability made by the IMF. You're going to be lacking on that issue. Second problem, they did not deal with like China remaining within the country, right? It's precisely because we have conditions met up, and the reason why we are making sure that Sri Lanka wouldn't make ties with China is because IMF is China, because IMF is actually being controlled by the Western region, right? Meaning to say here, we are going to make sure that Sri Lanka does not follow through with making more ties with Sri Lanka under their side of the house. It's precisely because China is going to flash their wad of money towards them, gives them more reason to actually make ties with China at the end of the day. And the third problem here is if your context of this country is that it's so bad and they need the money now, and Ramil could actually care about the image, obviously Ramil is going to look towards populism because they're going to cater to actually get the voters in the first place without being ousted in the long run. Meaning to say that precisely because of this, you're going to make more populist changes because they don't want to be treated as the next Rajapaksa family, but at the same time the lack of accountability is still going to be an issue. What do we contend on the outside of the house? We say that the conditional part of the bailout is giving the incentives for Sri Lanka to actually be good. Two impacts here. First and foremost, IMF is actually historically good at handling money. If we take a look at Indonesia and how IMF actually gave the bailout to Indonesia and how they can economically be more prosperous and revive afterwards, is one that is a good precedent to make sure that like Sri Lanka can be the next country to economically revive as well, right? But secondly, if we buy into government's context, the pressure to align with the conditionals are going to be met even more, precisely because the people need the money right now, and the changes are the urgency for Sri Lankans to actually enjoy the economic prosperity needs right now. Meaning to say, we've dealt with the issue of how IMF is going to be better outside of the house and why we're making sure that Ramil wouldn't be another Rajapaksa. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Opposition Whip, for your speech. To proceed with the next agenda, we will now continue our debate session for this round with the reply speech session. The reply speech shall be delivered first by the opposition team. Therefore, without further ado, I would like to invite Mr. Wan Amir Shakir and Wan Ahmad Afidi to deliver his speech and conclude their debate. Please welcome.
Is on government's logic. If their argument is more money is good because you need capital to progress, then that happens way more on Gulf, because if it's unconditional, why don't you take money from the IMF and China as well. We don't allow that on our side of the house because our setup already makes how if you trade with the IMF and you take our loan, you're unable to take money from China. This already means that we are insulated from all the harms of China's predatory loans. That already wins us the comparison. Second observation is on their context. They argue that there's so much political hate against Ranil and his way of governance, which is populism, and that he has been ousted for some reason. Firstly, he just got elected, but secondly, what really is this proper management that government talks about? Because we said that the management that is likely to be is populism, which is systemic within every single politician within Sri Lanka. We answered what is the way in which people get political currency, and that is the thing that we are principally against, which is exactly why the IMF structuring their loans will make it seem, will make it better because now you have economically sound policies. Their context doesn't match with what their benefit really is. Lastly, let's just address this case shift that was coming from GovWave, right? Because they first talked about how we need to give them money because Sri Lanka is in such a dire position. But when we POI and say, oh, what happens in the future? They're saying, oh, it's not their burden to give money in the future. This is their burden because your burden is decided by what you argue. If you argue in first that your principle is you need to give more money to people because they are suffering, in the future, which we argue is going to happen as a result of the systemic problems, then they will have to continuously give on money. The IMF has already given up on their principle to become the accountability mechanism of the world and gave free loans to every single country that is going through economic oppression. That is the principle lost that they contradicted in their third speech. What is the comparative issue on our side of the house? We're going with the issue of the principle because they have already given that up. Because if we are able to prove that there is success economically, then we satisfy the principle of giving food to the people on the ground in the government. Now, what is the issue that we win, which is the likelihood of success of getting out of the loan? They argue that there are harms of predatory loans, and this went on across the bench. But let's analyze why really they argue this. It's because they know that Sri Lanka is in a situation that is really bad and it's dire, which means that we are at a critical juncture of hitting predatory loans and hitting China's debt trap diplomacy, which is exactly why they're in talks with IMF to begin with. This means that there's so much political capital against populism, there's so much political capital against China, and to support any alternative that is far better than China. This already proves that Sri Lanka is likely to take the loan regardless of what it is. The question then becomes, should it be unconditional or should it be conditional? Our side of the house says that given that on both sides of the house we agree that they're going to come and take a loan anyway, we argue that it's better if we take the loan from the IMF. Given that Gov also concedes that the IMF is a really good actor, all those good things and good qualities of the IMF exist on our side of the house when we are managing the conditional aid that exists, which means that we get all the benefits of economic progression, we get all the benefits of the yardsticks of how we measure Sri Lanka's progression after we give them the initial loan, and if it so happens that there are problems down the road, we have expertise to put in more money in infrastructure or at least have some form of checks within the system of governance. This is comparatively better because this debunks the entire China argument. We're talking about the same actor here. On our side of the house, IMF is a better actor because of the accountability mechanisms. We get conditional loans which are easier to manage because a lot of the things that they want are very easy. Principle then, we argue the principle and we already want this because we proved to you that the IMF has never done this before and IMF should never do this because historically they have done this with Indonesia and they are able to develop their country through the infrastructure programs, through the progression of the economy, through overviewing the central banking authority within those countries. We have satisfied the principle, we have become, we're the most consistent team, we're just better with experience.
Thank you, representative from the opposition team for the revised speech. Now, I would like to invite Mr. Brian C. Chihan from the government team to proceed with their revised speech and conclude their debate. Please welcome.
Hello, I think it's clear that side opposition lives in a very deluded world where it's all rainbows and sunshines as to how they're able to solve the economic problems in Sri Lanka. Because yes, they've made it clear that they want to solve the political economic problems, but the process analysis and the steps to get there have been unclear throughout the debate. Two issues and metrics in which this debate needs to be considered. Firstly, in solving economic problems, and secondly, holding the government accountable. So on the first metric, on solving economic problems, we've been principally consistent throughout all speakers in Gulf by telling you there exist the two types of loans from IMF, or bailout from IMF. The conditional one, which is you either showing complete reforms or significant progress in order for you to get the particular loan in the first place, weighed out against unconditional loans that, yes, while there's no control, but at least IMF officers and IMF advisors or economists can still suggest policy reforms or maybe go to the country, maybe monitor development and so on. Let's weigh this up against what they therefore told you in opposition. Opposition's main contention is that we're going to do this based on progress. And I just want to point out this new material coming out in October, right? That suddenly there's going to be a mechanism on progressional aid when we've already been principally consistent and told you that literally conditional loan looks like you already showing the progress or you already making those radical reforms to begin with. So the progressional aid and new material cannot be credited in opposition world because firstly, that's just like a flat out lie, right? IMF loans and bailouts do not look like that. But even if it were to be true, it's just like way too late coming out in October. But secondly, in terms of them saying and them investing on how China, like they'll still trade with China regardless. While this may be true, little structural analysis was given in all three speakers. While weighed out in comparative and governance world, we've given you structural reasons as to why this could happen, which is the desperation effect, right? We tell you that they're currently taking loans now because they're in a very sticky position and they're in a desperate position. They need that initial capital, they need that initial like showmanship in order to show the IMF that reforms are currently happening. That's why they're going to take the loans. That's why they're going to take like Chinese FDI or OBOR and therefore secede territory if they cannot pay back. So all this will materialize at the end of the day based on the desperation effect that Sri Lanka is currently in right now, and that's extremely common. Second part in this like solving economic problems. So in terms of the way up between IMF and countries like China, Japan, and India, which by the way they didn't defend at all under their side, they just like had one or two statements saying that Chinese trade will still occur without posing structural analysis. We've given you a way out and comparative of why IMF is a far better actor because they don't have perverse incentives. They're independent, they're made up of different countries which all act as a counterbalance with one another, and they don't have like strings attached in terms of like ceding land towards their loans. The only way for you to like get this again is based on the initial capital. That's why unconditional loans are the preferable metric because you don't need to show like how significant progress you're making right now. We've even painted out clearly both in like all three of our speeches and shown principal consistency why they are currently right now $7 billion in debt. They like have zero foreign currency reserves, and because the system and structure in Sri Lanka is extremely dire, therefore policies or policy creation is very unsustainable in the best case scenario or won't even happen to begin with because of the lack of initial capital, and therefore weighed out against the perverse incentives and being forced into China's OBOR is a far worse scenario which we've already told you because it's a C plan to give away territory. Second metric as to how the whole government is going to do. We told you in the draft that Ranil obviously has an incentive to consolidate power. He's not going to like want to make very unpopular policies or stick to these policies in the past. He only has to do that because he's in a desperate position to get the loan in the first place. Which means to say that he won't take both Chinese and IMF loans because he's not in a desperate position anymore if he takes the IMF loans to begin with. So the OBOR and harms don't apply on the outside, but apply powers under the outside of the house. And therefore, in terms of clamping down justice or solving the economic issue, we solve that far better.
Thank you to the representative from the government team for your revised speech. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now reaching the end of our session today. Congratulations and thank you to all debaters from both teams for a wonderful, informative, and fruitful speech. Thank you so much for your cooperation and for your time spent here in this debate round. With that being said, this debate session is adjourned. Thank you so much, and Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Kamera sekali, tengok.
Yes.
Kamera ready? Okay, thank you.
Angin kencang itu menuntut satu kemauan, menegaskan satu pendirian. Bahasa Melayu itu satu perjuangan kemerdekaan, lambang perpaduan kebangsaan. 22 Jun 1956, hasil daripada kesaktian lidah rakyat, kami lahir sebagai institusi keramat dengan nama Dewan Bahasa dan Pustaka. Angin semilir bertiup perlahan-lahan memupuk rasa cinta dan penghayatan. Kami percaya ubur perjuangan mendaulatkan bahasa kebangsaan perlu sentiasa disemarakkan nyalanya. Angin kencang itu kembali datang membawa suara bantahan, meluahkan rasa kekecewaan. Sesungguhnya, bahasa Melayu itu mesti dipertahankan. Angin timur dan barat membawa harumnya wangian bahasa Melayu ke seluruh tanah air tercinta, melahirkan ribuan cerdik pandai, merentasi pelbagai bidang ilmu, memperkaya khazanah kesusasteraan, mendepani segala perubahan zaman. Kami hadir dengan semangat dan harapan memandaikan generasi masa hadapan yang tetap bertunjangkan kebangsaan. Angin sendalu menderu lembut, lalu membiaskan kedinginan. Dalam dunia yang sentiasa mengejar kepesatan, kami akan memastikan bahasa Melayu tidak akan ketinggalan dengan penghasilan produk dan perkhidmatan yang akan memberikan nilai ekonomi. Angin pancaroba sering berubah-ubah tiupannya, membawa cabaran dan halangan. Kami tetap akan membakar semangat, memupuk rasa kebersamaan agar anda sentiasa berdiri bangga di mata dunia dengan identiti kebangsaan yang tidak pernah sesekali goyah. Kami sedar angin akan terus bertiup yang akan membuatkan anda berhadapan keraguan kesetiaan. Tetapi kami akan tetap berdiri teguh kerana kami satu-satunya petugas zaman yang akan tetap mempertahankan. Kerana kami Dewan Bahasa dan Pustaka lahir dari restu jiwa pahlawan. Kami ucapkan dengan sepenuh keazaman, bahasa itu jiwa bangsa.
اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق خلق الإنسان من علق اقرأ وربك الأكرم الذي علم بالقلم علم الإنسان ما لم يعلم.
Angin kencang itu menuntut satu kemahuan, menegaskan satu pendirian, bahawa bahasa Melayu itu satu perjuangan kemerdekaan, lambang perpaduan kebangsaan. 22 Jun 1956, hasil daripada kesaktian lidah rakyat, kami lahir sebagai institusi keramat dengan nama Dewan Bahasa dan Pustaka. Angin semilir bertiup perlahan-lahan memupuk rasa cinta dan penghayatan. Kami percaya ubur perjuangan mendaulatkan bahasa kebangsaan perlu sentiasa disemarakkan nyalanya. Angin kencang itu kembali datang membawa suara bantahan, meluahkan rasa kekecewaan. Sesungguhnya, bahasa Melayu itu mesti dipertahankan. Angin timur dan barat membawa harumnya wangian bahasa Melayu ke seluruh tanah air tercinta, melahirkan ribuan cerdik pandai, merentasi pelbagai bidang ilmu, memperkaya khazanah kesusasteraan, mendepani segala perubahan zaman. Kami hadir dengan semangat dan harapan memandaikan generasi masa hadapan yang tetap bertunjangkan kebangsaan. Angin sendalu menderu lembut, lalu membiaskan kedinginan. Dalam dunia yang sentiasa mengejar kepesatan, kami akan memastikan bahasa Melayu tidak akan ketinggalan dengan penghasilan produk dan perkhidmatan yang akan memberikan nilai ekonomi. Angin pancaroba sering berubah-ubah tiupannya, membawa cabaran dan halangan. Kami tetap akan membakar semangat, memupuk rasa kebersamaan agar anda sentiasa berdiri bangga di mata dunia dengan identiti kebangsaan yang tidak pernah sesekali goyah. Kami sedar angin akan terus bertiup yang akan membuatkan anda berhadapan keraguan, kesetiaan. Tetapi kami akan tetap berdiri teguh kerana kami satu-satunya petugas zaman yang akan tetap mempertahankan. Kerana kami Dewan Bahasa dan Pustaka lahir dari restu jiwa pahlawan. Kami ucapkan dengan sepenuh keazaman, bahasa itu jiwa bangsa.
اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق خلق الإنسان من علق اقرأ وربك الأكرم الذي علم بالقلم علم الإنسان ما لم يعلم